So this supplement lecture we're going to talk about databases. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do a very simple application where we're going to bring in a database, we're going to query it for some data, update it, delete it, pull some data back, display it in a data grid. So in this particular example, I've got a Windows Forms application, and so what we're going to do is we're going to click this button here called Get Data. We're going to run some code that just displays data into this particular data grid view control. I've got some other buttons here where we're going to return a single value from the database, and then we're going to delete some data from the database. So what we're going to do is I'm going to bring up this access database here, which is one you've seen before. This is the authors database, and inside of it there's an authors table with author ID, first name, and last name. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do now is I'm going to close this down. I'm going to bring up my desktop where I've put this particular DB file. And I'm going to then navigate. So this is the name of my project, Windows Forms App 2. I'm going to go into the bin directory, debug directory, and I'm going to paste this in here because this is going to be the same directory where my exe is created. So now, why am I putting it here? Well, I'm putting it here because my data access class is going to, by default, look in the same directory that it's executing in, which is this bin directory. The big mistake a lot of students make is they'll actually hard code in the path to wherever their database is. Well, that path that's on your computer is not going to be the same as on my computer, and so you're going to get docked points because I have to actually go into your code and fix it and change the path to find it on my computer. So now that I've put this here, let me show you another problem that I've noticed a lot of students make, is that when they come into the solution, what they'll actually do here is students a lot of times will actually want to add in the database file itself to this application. And so let me show you the problem, what happens when you do that. So if you add in this MDB file, our actual database, the thing that you don't realize is that by default this particular file has a property that says copy to output directory, copy always. So every time you compile your application, what it does is it takes this database file and it overwrites the database file that's currently in that bin directory. So what that means is let's say you run your application, you do a bunch of inserts, updates, and deletes, close down your application. Let's say you try to test it to make sure that those got into your database, so you run your application again, and lo and behold, none of your updates are there. Well, why is that? Because when you ran your application again, this copy always was on, and so it overwrote your database. So if you're going to do it this way, then just change it to copy if newer. And so that'll help solve a big problem that you're having there. So if we're ever dealing with a database, just use the data access class that we've already written together. So let's just go ahead and right click, add an existing item. And the same thing on my desktop here, I've got this data access class. So let's take a look at what this data access class actually did. Well, one, it had this constructor that sets up our connection string to our Microsoft database. And over here, you'll notice that we're going to have to change this to authors, just like you would have to do if you're dealing with your assignment. So if it's the reservation system for your final group project, you'd have to change the database name here, or if it's your airline reservation system, you'd have to change it to that database. Now within this particular class, we've got three methods: execute SQL, execute Scalar, and execute non-query. So execute SQL you would use anytime you're querying the data. So anytime you're doing a select statement, so you're selecting data from the database and you want to return that data, it's going to return it into a data set, you use execute SQL. So what that does is it comes in here, it creates a connection to the database, it creates a data adapter, opens that connection, passes in your SQL statement to your, creates a new command object passing your SQL statement, which then sets that inside the data adapter. This data adapter fill is what actually connects to the database, executes the SQL statement, pulls the data back, fills up this data set with data, which is the job of the data adapter. It then returns through a reference parameter right here how many rows were returned, so we know how many records were matched to our select statement. That returns that data set. Now remember, the reason we have these using statements here is anytime you have an object that when you instantiate it, it also implements the iDisposable interface. You can put that within the using statement so that when it hits these end brackets, it automatically calls the dispose method for you, even if an exception occurs within. Now execute scalar is when you want to maybe select a single value, like select the author ID where the first name and last name equals this, something of that nature. So if you want a single value returned, so your select statement's only going to return one value, that's where execute scalar comes in. Now execute non-query is the method you're going to use if you run an insert statement, an update statement, a delete statement. And so you'll notice there's no data set that's returned, just the number of rows that were affected by your statement. So if you did a delete statement and you wanted to delete just a single row, this better return 1. So that way you can actually check in your application. So let's go back to our window. We'll do get data. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create an SQL statement. Now, the other thing I want to preface with this is that while I'm writing all this code behind the UI, none of this should be behind the UI. I'm just doing it for simplicity's sake. No business logic should be behind the UI, which means the UI should know nothing about a data set. It should know nothing about SQL statements. All of this logic should be abstracted out into another class that holds all of your business logic. So please don't write anything behind the UI that has like a data set, that has an SQL statement. All of that data, all of that logic and data should be put into a separate class. So again, we're only doing this for simplicity purposes. So let's go ahead and set up our SQL statement, and let's do a really simple SQL statement. We'll say select all from the authors table. So again, we've got this books database, authors table, so we're just doing select all from authors. So we should select all of this data. So now that we've done that, we want to actually get all of our data out. So what we're going to do is we're going to instantiate our data access class. Now you always want to instantiate classes in the constructor or some method that has a try-catch block, so we can always handle an exception if it ever gets thrown. So now what we can do is we can say db.execute SQL. We can pass in our SQL statement, and you'll notice that it also wants this reference parameter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump up here. This is the number of return values. We'll just go ahead and set that equal to 0. And so I'm going to pass this in. And it's just a convenient way of telling us how many rows were returned. So we don't actually have to dive into our data set and then our data table to actually look at that. So now that executed the statement, now you notice this returned us a data set. So we're also going to need a data set. And so we can set this ds equals. So now our data set actually holds that data. So what we can do now is we've got our data grid view 1 data source, and we can set that equal to our first table in our database. So now a better way to do this would actually to have all this logic up here in a business logic class, gets this data set back from the database, then loops through each data row and fills up a generic list of all that row. So if you look at the other supplemental lecture for list, data binding, and passing around data, that'll show you the other portion of what you should actually do. And so what you want to get is all this data into a generic list, which is a collection of all the objects. So in this case, it would be authors. So you'd have a list of authors objects. Then you would bind that list to this data grid view. But we're just kind of doing a simple test here. So now if we run it, and we click our button, it blows up. Of course it does. So it could not find the file authors.mdb. So I really meant to do that. So we come in here, oh, it's books.mdb, not authors. So we come back to our data access class. We come up here, and instead of authors, we call this books. So now we go ahead and run it again, click our button, and we can see it fills it up with data. So now let's go ahead and try to exercise some of these other methods. So let's get a single record here. So now let's run it so we can see some data. And so we've got this field called author ID, and let's get author ID. Let's get all their data where author ID equals 4. So we're going to do the same sort of thing here. Don't need that. Also don't need data set. So we're going to say, instead of select all, we're going to say select the author ID from authors. I can delete that. We don't need the semicolon. Either of those works fine though. Then we'll say where author ID equals 3. Sorry, I meant select all. Sorry, select all from authors, or author ID equals 3. And so now what we can do is we can say db.execute Scaler Sql. I'm just really messing this up, aren't I? So we wanted to get a single value, so let's get the first name. So in our database table, let's do, so it should return back Tim. So we want just the first name, so a single piece of data. So select the first name from authors where author ID equals 3. We're going to pass in our SQL statement. And so we can see here it's going to return us a string. So what we can do now is come back to our design. We've got this label 1. So we're going to say label, whoops, label 1, the text equals that. Oops, LBL single. That's what I did wrong. Apologize. So what we did was we said, hey, we just want to get a single piece of information. So since we only wanted an ID or first name or last name, in this case first name, we're going to execute Scalar and set it that equal to our label there. So you can see it returns that name. And so now the next thing we're going to want to do is if we ever want to say delete data. So let's say we want to delete from authors where author ID equals 3. What we can do now is say db.execute non-query. And so this returns an integer and it'll tell us how many rows it affected. So maybe let's just go ahead and do this same label up here. And so now when I run this and we delete a line, so this is going to return an integer, so I need to change that to a string first. Let's run that. So now when I delete this, we can see that it actually deleted 1 row from our database. So this is a very generic and just basic overview of how you can use the data access class, what it does, how you can pull data out, and be able to bind the data source. So the next thing I want to talk about, since we've covered those, is just how we can actually debug and loop through our data set. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and set a breakpoint here. Now when I get the data and I press F10, it now filled up my data set. So what I can do is actually highlight this, click my little button here, and you can see that magnifying glass actually shows me all of the data that was in my data set. What I can also do if I want is I can do a for each statement, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to say for each data row, call it dr, in my data set dot table sub 0 dot rows. And so what this will allow me to do is actually loop through each of my data rows within my data set. And so now I can do, whatever piece of information I want with this particular data row. So one of the things I find, again, is just becoming more familiar with the debugger and how you can actually loop through and take a look at what data is actually being returned from your data set. Then as you loop through each row, making sure you're pulling out the correct data. I see that problem a lot. So hopefully this kind of helped, work through some issues with the database, and let me know if you have any issues.